we're waiting for one or two more, but I think let's get started. So mine is just a brief. My name is Marissa van Rensburg. I work for SALO, and mine is just to briefly open the meeting. So today we are all, I'm sure, people who are, I've seen some of the names in the room. I'm sure everybody who is involved in G20 is only like now recovering G20 and COP30, but it's been a busy time. So I think it's good to have just a reflection of what's happened in the last month with these two very important processes. And often we find that people who were involved in one, the unfortunate timing that they're happening concurrently. But I think it's also important for people and beneficial for people who were more involved in one of the in either the COP or G20 to learn about, to get a reflection, to benefit from a reflection on the outcomes of the other process. But yeah, so I would just like to briefly say welcome to this meeting. Thank you. It is December, and for those of us joining from South Africa, we know what that means to us. December, it's the last day of school for most people. So I want to say thank you for joining and taking the time to join. And we hope that you enjoy the program, and that we really do take the opportunity to take in what speakers, especially who have been so involved, our speakers who were very involved in these different processes, take on board what they say, so that we can actually not let this momentum as a region, let this moment go, but actually move forward with energy at the start of next year, if we're honest with ourselves, not December. But it's been a really heartening time to see especially in Southern Africa, to see the collaboration that has been missing in the last decade. Isn't maybe not where it needs to be, but it is really important to keep those links. All these new WhatsApp groups that have been born out of the processes leading to COP and G20. We need to keep these networks and the spirit of collaboration as a region. It needs to only strengthen, not just fizzle out as a momentary thing from COP and G20. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Kudakwashe Manjonjo from PowerShift Africa. He is their Just Transition Advisor. Kudakwashe, and just to say, Kudakwashe actually he'll be our speaker speaking to both COP and G20, as he was very involved throughout the year in various processes leading up to the G20, and he also was at the COP30. So thank you, Kudakwashe.
Thank you so much, Marisa, and hi everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. I think you made a good point that it makes absolutely no sense that G20 and COP are back-to-back events where we expect global leaders to be present for both events. I think it's a travesty of great proportions for the importance of both platforms, and hopefully some logic comes soon, and that doesn't happen, I think, not only for our leaders, but also for us who are involved in civil society. That said, as someone who works at Post-G20 Africa, which does focus a lot on climate change issues around energy, finance, and adaptation, we had the opportunity of being involved in both COP and G20, and I had to make the decision to be at COP, but I knew we were ably supported with those colleagues who were able to stay in South Africa for that. So I think what I will try to do today is to give you a very brief I'm going to try to provide a brief framework to explain why these two processes, first of all, are linked, and we should never negate how linked they are, first of all, but also to show some of the common issues that came out from the just transition logic that we are at least trying to push through in both spaces. And I think my focus will really be around the idea of what just transition means for both G20 and the COP process. We'll also look at the role of fossil fuels that came out prominently in both COP30, G20, as well as the issue around clean cooking, the issue around critical minerals, which is a personal focus of mine. And I do think it's very important in terms of the just transition work. And lastly, to see what that could look like in terms of our future plans, especially within the Southern African region. And I think, first of all, what I'll start off with is explaining what the just transition momentum was like in Brazil in COP. For those who might not know, the COP30 process, there are basically quite a number of negotiation platforms for key issues that are at hand. One of those key issues that were at hand were conversations around the Just Transition Work Program, which essentially was supposed to be the space for parties to essentially agree as to what they are defining as just transition and what that could look like. Global civil society really were pushing for something that I think is extremely important, which was basically the establishment of a just transition mechanism, a global just transition mechanism. To put context to this, we are all quite aware of the Just Transition Energy Program that came out of South Africa and now is in Senegal and Indonesia. And the JETP programs were basically country-focused plans in terms of how to actually transition. And of course, using the Southern Africa example with South Africa, the focus was on what would it look like for the transition, especially the energy transition needed in Mpumalanga. This, of course, did make sense, and it actually did come out of the COP process. I think it was COP 27 or 28, if I'm not mistaken, where the JP was agreed on. And it does, on face value, does make sense. But a big critique of it was it is impossible for South Africa to transition or to get financing and funding for a transition and ignoring the rest of the region. We're all very aware of how interlinked our energy systems are in Southern Africa, and even to the extent where what South Africa does has a disproportionate effect on the rest of the other regions. So, for example, if South Africa JP was only going to give funding for Mpumalanga region, what happens to the Gaza province, which is supplying gas to South Africa, SASO? What happens to the Wange region, which is the Mpumalanga version, but in Zimbabwe, supplying coal to ArcelorMittal. So the JP in itself, even though it did make sense at one base level, it did not do what was needed to provide coherence, knowledge sharing, and coordination amongst countries for just transition. And that's why we really push for a global transition mechanism. This is probably the only good thing that came out of COP30. If I'm going to be honest with you, that there was an agreement of setting up this just transition mechanism. And I'm really hoping we can use this to leverage the need for us to really start working with a more cross-country understanding of what these just transition plans mean. Understanding that these borders that we do live and work under are in themselves very false. And if anything, our energy systems do not comprehend or agree to those borders. And we believe that this mechanism is extremely important. On the G20 side, we did see the acknowledgement of what they call the just transition pathways. And if you see the quote, and I'll be quick with it, it speaks about how we recognize national just transition pathways as key enablers of climate action, encompassing whole of economy and whole of society approaches. This language is very much something that came out of the COP process. So it's good to see that these things are mirroring each other. But as we all know, it's easy to get these words out, but it's really important to actually get the actions out. So I think what's really important, at least from a just transition mechanism point of view and infrastructure point of view, there's a strong need for other countries in Southern Africa to really start setting up just transition institutions or pathways that then speak and coordinate with what is happening in South Africa. That was around what just transition basically means in the two spaces. Another big issue that came out was the role of fossil fuels. We're all quite aware that's mainly primarily what a lot of us are here for, right? To see what would that kind of look like. In the COP process, it became called TAF, which was basically this very Nicodemus solution that came, in my opinion, from Norway around transitioning away from fossil fuels pathway or project, which was being pushed by the EU and some other countries from the global south to basically say that we did agree in COP28 in Dubai for us to transition away from fossil fuels, but what's actually being done for this? In face value, this is extremely important. There's no denying that. However, I think an important critique that came out not only from civil society but from some global south countries was we can't talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels and creating another task force without acknowledging that a lot of countries do not produce their national determined contributions in time. So these are the NDCs, which is supposed to outline how countries are going to transition away. So it seemed more like a political ploy in terms of what, for example, the EU was trying to get out of the COP process against some of the biggest challenges in the process, primarily, of course, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, India and China. So there was a bit of nuance to that. And I think it's important for us as a society to start thinking with ourselves to say, The transitioning away from fossil fuels does not then mean that there is no obligation of the historically global emitters to actually lead the process. And it seems in a lot of ways that that's what was coming out of that process. It is important to also acknowledge that out of the COP30 process, there was a removal of the term transition fuels from the Just Transition Work Program text, at least in the final iteration. This was something that was pushed for by, to be frank with you, a lot of African countries and, of course, other global south countries that are heavily reliant on gas, and they're wanting to position gas as a transition fuel. There was a lot of pushback to say that we cannot have this language. And on a very personal and, of course, as Partnership Africa, we do believe that's important, especially for a lot of countries on the continent that actually do not need gas to transition. Renewable energy is by far a cheaper option, and the gas exploits is really more of something that's coming out of private sector and corporates that really want to keep a system of ensuring that they're having solid returns on investments, which they not cannot get from renewable energy. Renewable energy by itself is very democratic in terms of being a source, and as we all know, usually democratic spaces and sources of energy do not lead to monopolization, where profits are the source, where the monopoly is the source of profits for these companies. So gas is being positioned as a transition fuel. So that being pushed away, I think that was important. And I think this was also coming out of the G20 process where there was no direct, at least, conversations around this. And that's because, as we all know, a lot of the G20 countries are heavily reliant on gas or are positioning gas as one of their future key markets and key industries. So a lot of work needs to be done on that to show that the danger of stranded assets has not stopped and is not going to stop. But you can see the discrepancy in terms of what's happening on the ground and what's happening in terms of corporations and governments in terms of their outlook of what gas could look like. One interesting commonality that came out was this issue around clean cooking. At the COP process, Tanzania, who were leading the Africa group of negotiators this year, were unapologetic about making clean cooking the primary tool to define what just transition would look like. Again, at face value, this makes sense. We all agree that we need clean cooking, especially for a lot of our African countries and a lot of our African communities that still rely on biomass. That's not a question. But the question then becomes, what is clean cooking and what does that look like, right? You will see in the G20 text, it does mention clean cooking as a key outcome of the G20 process pushed by South Africa, which is great. But importantly, this text does say that clean cooking does not just mean gas. And this is extremely important. There's a positioning of defining clean cooking as just being gas. The argument being that there is no global region that has transitioned to clean cooking without going through gas. And to be fair with you, and to be honest with you, I think that speaks against a lot of African experiences where we've been skipped by a number of revolutions. We always speak about the cell phone revolution and how a lot of countries do not have telephones and they just skip to the cell phone revolution. So it's also important in our conversations around clean cooking to ensure that we remind our national leaders that clean cooking does not have to be gas. There are so many other options, and there are a lot more transformative options. There's also a danger, and I think it's important to put a gender lens to this, that the people who are pushing for clean cooking in a lot of ways are men who do not cook. And this might sound like it's a crazy thing, but it's an important thing because they then think clean cooking is the beginning and the end of what transformative energy looks like for women, and that's not the case. Grid infrastructure is a lot more important, and basically narrowing it down to just being clean cooking is something that we need to push back against, to say that it's clean cooking and other things that a lot of our African countries need. And lastly, I think there's been a lot of conversations around the role of critical minerals in terms of the transition globally. In the G20 process, we saw, and I think in a very good way, the critical minerals framework that was agreed on in the G20 process. But it is important to recognize that this was a voluntary process. At the same time, the COP30 process, civil society and some global south countries, especially African countries, were pushing for the mentioning of those critical minerals in the just transition text. However, and this is important to note, China opposed that. They were the only country that opposed any language around minerals. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that the reason? From the intel that I have received, we're being told that China is not comfortable with global legal frameworks around transition minerals. They prefer bilateral agreements between, for example, China and Africa, China and South Africa, those kind of situations compared to having these global legal frameworks. And I think we should push against this. In the G20 process, we did see the China Critical Minerals Initiative that also came out, where a number of global South countries are partnering with China around critical minerals. This is definitely a power play. And we have to realize that China realizes that the only strong tool that a lot of African countries have when it comes to these minerals is having standard regulations around what it means to mine these minerals. And China do not want to do this. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done with that. So even though the G20 process did come up with a voluntary framework, we should remind ourselves that it's still a voluntary one that will just probably just give indications of what governments will try to do, but it is in no way binding, but it's our role to then ensure that some of the good things that we want in terms of what value addition and beneficiation could look like for Southern Africa, which does hold about 25% of those minerals, does actually come to the forefront. In conclusion, I think I've taken enough time on this. It's also important to ask ourselves, what does this look like? And I think, Marissa, you mentioned this. What does our future look like since we're left the COP30 process, we've left G20, G20 is going to USA. I think we should applaud South Africa for them standing up against Donald Trump. It's been ridiculous to see what they've been doing. I think it's also important to acknowledge how South Africa invited other countries from Southern Africa to be key members of the actual G20 meeting, such as Zimbabwe and Namibia. These are strong indications. But more importantly, Cyril Ramaphosa, President Ramaphosa, my apologies, is taking over the SADC chair over the next year from Madagascar because of the coup that happened. That means South Africa is in a position to carry on a lot of this work that has been done. And we can break down some of these ideas that came from the G20 process into the SADC process as much as possible. What could that really look like? Trying to see what we can do in terms of SADC, setting up a just transition pathway framework, for example, trying to understand what a critical minerals framework could look like for Southern Africa. And also importantly, something that a lot of people do not know. South Africa is not a signatory of the Protocol of Trade and Industry in Southern Africa, which basically means that we are relying on bilateral agreements for the trade of Southern Africa to actually move. And this includes things like minerals and actually affects things like how our energy systems are running. This needs to be changed. South Africa did sign for this protocol this year, but they have not ratified it. So this is a very practical thing that we need to push President Ramaphosa to say that it's all nice and good to be pushing for G20 leadership and to be doing the right things at a global level. But here in the region, South Africa needs to step up and actually sign up to some of the protocols that will actually lead to a lot of the ideals that we have for regional integration. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kudakwashe. That was a very rich presentation. Thank you. I'm very grateful for the way you opened the meeting. It was a lot of food for thought. Thank you. And just for the sake of time, I will be a very swift chair so that we have time to engage at the end. I will introduce our next speaker, who is Tanya van Mielis. Tanya is the head of the policy unit for COSATU, and as part of that function, she coordinated the L20 technical team for the G20. So you can please have Tanya.
Thanks very much. Good morning to everybody, and thank you to SALO for inviting me to come and speak at this event. For me, there are a few key questions we need to ask ourselves. The first is if we're going to evaluate what we got out of our engagements in the G20 and COP30, what criteria do we use to evaluate? And I want to suggest up front, before I even start going into the substance, a few ways that we can look at this. The one is to say, were we at the table or were we on the menu? It really speaks to, are we engaged in the critical discussions that affect our lives? Are we able to influence policy? So are we there is the first question. The second question that I want to ask is, are we able to influence policy or get results that are meaningful for workers, for working class people? And the third key thing that I want to ask is, what does it mean for building our organizations and building power. And I'm going to run through those as we're going through the discussion. But it's really, are we at the table or are we on the menu? Did we see some substantive gains that will impact our lives? And lastly, what does it mean for building organization and building power? If we're looking at the just transition as a broad concept, we've been having very interesting discussions as Labour recently. So comrades will know that COSATU has done a lot of work around the just transition. We've looked at the energy transition, but we've also looked, for example, at what a just transition means in agriculture, in transport, in care work as examples. And central to a just transition is that there must be justice. So we don't take the notion that a transition will be just. We take the view that we have to contest strongly to ensure that there is indeed justice in a transition. And the second key thing that we've been looking at, besides that of being contested, is that at this point, there are many transitions. So if we look, for example, there's the just energy transition, but for example, there's a transition in the digital space with artificial intelligence as well. There are a range of transitions. So what we want to do as COSATU when we're looking at transitions is to say it's not only the just energy transition that indeed must be just, but we want a lot of the principles to flow through a range of other transitions. What would make a transition just for us? Well, there needs to be procedural justice. So we need to be able to engage, for example. We need to be able to influence the policy. It needs to be done in time. There needs to be distributive justice. So we can't have a transition that reinforces the existing status quo with the existing power relations, the existing high levels of inequality. Are we seeing a flow of power, a flow of influence to workers and the working class, to communities? And are we seeing a flow of economic power as well in that transition? And is there substantive justice? We want to make sure that in a just transition, no one is left behind. So, for example, for workers, it would mean no job loss for workers, jobs being created, net job creation. It would mean ensuring that there's social protection for workers, but also social protection for communities more broadly affected. Part of social protection is that COSATU advances its demand for a universal basic income grant. It means, for example, that we need land redistribution. It means for COSATU that we need an end to austerity measures in our budget, and we need a more just budget. Central to a just transition is that the state must be at the center. We can't have a transition where more and more state functions land up being divvied out to the private sector. So if one looks at the energy transition and whether it's just or not, the rise of public-private partnerships, as an example, would be a problem for us. We want strong government at the center, and we want government with an end to austerity measures that is adequately resourced. So given that broad conceptualization, what did we take? What demands did we take to G20 and COP30, just broadly? And there are a few key areas that we looked at. The one was that people must be at the center of transitions. Not only workers, but those who are unemployed, the working class more broadly. Then also specific focus on women, on youth, on people living with disabilities, and people who are marginalized. Are they at the core? And if we say they must be at the core, it's not only saying that there must be a voice, that they need to be at the table, not on the menu, but in fact that the policies coming out must reflect their interests. So, for example, we've taken demands around relooking financing. We know the current financing now is financing private sector investment, private sector interests, and supporting export of energy towards old and now new colonial powers. The question for us is is there sufficient financing for social ownership, for state ownership, for community ownership, for worker ownership? We know the answer is no. That's something that we need to keep pushing. What we said as well is, while we're addressing these things, you can't do it without looking at the financial architecture. We know the current financial architecture and the debt architecture is severely limiting the development of many developing countries, in fact, most, if not all developing countries, and that historical debt should be addressed. We need not only debt relief, but we wanted to see debt cancellation. That wasn't one. We said we wanted to see job creation and decent work, not any jobs, but decent work. And we wanted to see industrial strategy that helps build developing countries' capabilities, industrialization, and longer-term sustainable futures. Now, what we got out of some of the statements is we got things that look like they're supportive of some of the proposals that we put forward. The language is broad, and I think one of the challenges in any of these large international negotiations is we can come with a list of complex demands. I mean, the work that was done by labor, by civil society in preparation for the G20 was phenomenal. There were detailed documents. We debated and discussed positions at length and put in very substantive demands. The texts that come out of these processes land up being quite broad. Some of the text, in fact, most of the text from COP30 is on a voluntary basis. Text from G20 and COP30 comes out saying, providing for countries to allow for their own national objectives and priorities. So the text creates a lot of wiggle room, but the text also provides us as activists with key hooks that we can hold our own national governments to account and allow us to campaign going forward. Now, I want to give some examples of wording that reflects the broad push, certainly from Labour, but also from civil society. So, for example, from the G20 text, wording like, we underscore the importance of integrated, inclusive, people-centered, and comprehensive approaches. In terms of our demands around employment and decent work, a rights-based approach to transitions. We got wording such as employment is a central objective of economic growth, and good quality jobs and decent work must be at the heart of sustainable industrialization. That's important not only for people who are working now, who have decent work, those who are working and where unions are not recognized, for example, where there isn't collective bargaining, it provides wording to fight for the recognition of trade unions, for the recognition of collective bargaining, for formalization of workers working in the informal sector. But there's wording that supports the idea that we had proposed of expanding social protection. So, for example, the leaders committed to coordinated policies that link industrialization with the creation of decent jobs and social protection and respect of labor rights as engines of inclusive growth, ensuring that economic policies drive productivity and equity and leaves no one behind, which is very important. It accepts that there must be robust institutions. So it says, for example, robust labor institutions, fair wage setting mechanisms, and universal and adaptive social protection are essential to reducing inequalities and fostering resilience. And I can go on and on. So that wording is broad. Would we have liked tighter stuff? Would we have liked wording forgiving debt, for example, something more radical? Of course we would have. Did we get it? No. Is it realistic that we expect it at this point? Well, these are large international institutions, and what we've seen is that the changes that we've made over time have been incremental changes over time. Have we made some incremental changes now, both in substance? Yes, we've got wording that allows us to move forward. In terms of participation, yes, there was greater participation, certainly in this G20, by civil society than in previous ones. And I certainly hope that the US and countries going forward are able to build on what South Africa has done and how South Africa has opened the doors to greater participation. So there was more participation as well. What it does do is it provides an opportunity for us now to build on what we've already done. So when I'm saying how do we evaluate, I'm saying part of it is looking at how do we build organizations, how do we shift power. My experience was that civil society organizations, labor, various NGOs, various community-based organizations, T20, I mean, the range, academic institutions, faith-based institutions, worked really, really well together. I haven't seen that level of us working together since I think probably the 1980s. It was very encouraging. So what I think we need to do now is take some of the broad wording that we want, that is pushing right-based approach, that is seeing people at the center of transitions, and that we make demands on our governments using that wording. The second key thing that I think that we should be doing is the G20 certainly, but also how we picked it up going to COP, helped bring Africa and the problems we in Africa face as a whole to the fore. That pressure needs to be sustained. Certainly as the trade unions, we held a number of meetings, physical and online meetings in the L20 with our sister unions across Africa and then also from the global south. That was very encouraging. It did help build unity. It did help build a common position that needs to be taken forward. Where there were substantive gains, and I'm going to speak, for example, about the Brisbane eThekwini goal to reduce the gender gap. So it was there were commitments and there were firm targets set to increase women's participation in the labour force, but also to decrease the wage gap in the labour force as well. We need to all go back and push our governments to do that. That's not only an issue for workers who are in work now, but we can link it to the range of other transitions. So, for example, we're looking at technological transitions. Part of those transitions are ensuring that workers and people who want to become workers get adequate training and retraining. Are they getting that? Are they getting decent jobs? We know the range of problems associated with platform workers at the moment. That's something that all of us can be taking up. Are young people who want to develop apps, are they able to develop those apps? Are they able to create sustainable livelihoods for themselves on those apps? What's happening in competition policy on those areas? There's a range of struggles we still need to take forward. So my suggestions going forward, and it builds very much on what Kudakashe had raised earlier, is that we build on what we've already won, that we build organization, that we build collaboration. We make sure that we're wording in the agreements that is voluntary. We take that forward and push for implementation, not only in our own countries, but in solidarity with sister unions, organizations, civil society formations across Africa and indeed across the global south. So while we see the G20 and COP as an event, it's really part of an ongoing process that if we to measure success, yes, we were at the table. Yes, we got some progressive wording in, albeit voluntary, and some of it be it vague, or, to national interests. But are we going to use the space to build an organization? We were able to build it in the run-up to those events, at those events. Now we need to keep building organization, building our power, and running campaigns going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you for that rich presentation. That really, it's very important to have the voice of unions represented, but also you can tell how deeply involved you were in the process leading up to the G20, the G20 itself. As I said, I will be a very brief chair. I won't summarize each speaker. I will just introduce the next speaker now. Our next speaker is Raisa Cole. She is a climate governance specialist and researcher bridging policy, urban justice, and systemic change with a decade of experience from grassroots to global institutions. She began her career conducting disaster risk assessments for the World Food Programme across Southern Africa before specializing in urban development through her MSc in International Cooperation and Urban Development. She has advanced climate diplomacy and action working with international organizations like the African Risk Capacity, GIZ, Climate Group, and IFAD. She's currently a PhD candidate at Wageningen, I hope I said it right, University, researching subnational climate governance in African cities. She simultaneously leads climate governance programming at Democracy Works Foundation, and this year she chaired the Foundation's 20, a group of 80 plus philanthropies and foundations committed to just action on climate and sustainability issues. At the core of her work is a commitment to decolonizing the climate movement, approaching governance as both a technical challenge and a transformative opportunity to dismantle systems of oppression locally and globally. Thank you, Raisa, if we can have you.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you for inviting me. I don't know, I have a presentation, but maybe I don't need to put it up. I thought today we could talk a little bit about other agenda setting platforms throughout this year in this kind of just transition space. And Foundations 20 has done quite a bit of work in kind of assessing the extent to which our recommendations that we published in February this year kind of made it into, or what the kind of convergence and divergence points are with our recommendations, and other kind of just transition agenda setting moments across the year. The one is obviously the G20, because that's our main kind of advocacy moment, and how we kind of organize our work. But others obviously include kind of COPs, and then a big one was the kind of BRICS summit, and the publishing of the BRICS roadmap on energy cooperation. So Foundations 20 in February this year published 7 recommendations. The first one focusing on economic prosperity, seeing the just energy transition as a pathway to achieving that kind of economic prosperity. And then we had just energy transitions throughout our recommendations. So the second one was around catalyzing sustainable industrial decarbonization. The third was around transforming the global financial system to drive climate and development goals. The fourth was around strategically aligning and mobilizing flexible financial resources with climate goals and sustainable development. And then the fifth was around driving solutions to climate smart agriculture and biodiversity. And we had quite there wasn't any kind of mention of just energy transition in that one. But then we went on to like the sixth recommendation, which was kind of intersectional environmentalism and equitable climate solutions, where we talked a lot about the kind of justice elements of the energy transition. And then the seventh one is to strengthen country platforms for effective development cooperation, and that obviously focused a lot around kind of financing the just transition. We've spent the last couple of weeks really looking at how these recommendations showed up, or how they kind of diverged or converged with the G20 declaration. Noting that we put quite a bit of effort throughout the year in acting as a kind of bridge or cross-pollinator between engagement groups, really trying to kind of consolidate messaging around climate and energy democracy across these engagement groups, and then kind of creating some sort of like coordination around messaging on on like defining what like justice actually means within an energy transition. There were kind of 7 or 6 key points of kind of convergence and divergence, and so I'll just run through them. The one was around energy expansion. The foundation's 20 recommendations really pushed for like rapid science-aligned renewable scale-up and the phase down of fossil fuels. And what we saw in the G20 declaration was that it kind of maintained a certain level of technological like neutrality, which kind of obviously leaves room for continued fossil fuel use. The second point was around financing and de-risking mechanisms. And yeah, obviously F20 being kind of this a platform for philanthropies and foundations to who are committed to kind of climate action and sustainable development. The de-risking aspect was very important to us, just because that's a big role that kind of philanthropies play. And have been called on to play in this current kind of shrinking ODA environment. And so F20 really called for stronger accountability, transparency, and standards attached to finance flows, where within the space where the G20 language remains very kind of voluntary and less prescriptive, and kind of avoids sort of governance conditions around climate financing and de-risking mechanisms. Then we looked at kind of social inclusion and community rights, which was a cross-cutting theme across our 7 recommendations. And we really provided kind of detailed recommendations on Indigenous rights, community consent, kind of safety nets, labor transitions, and human rights protections, whereas the G20 declaration used or purposefully used kind of broader language without kind of operational commitments, and that's obviously because of the kind of consensus-based structure of the G20. But yeah, very kind of broad, non-committal language we found. And then the next was around kind of infrastructure and grid modernization. We really emphasized like decentralized governance, community energy systems, and kind of rights-based infrastructure development. While the G20 kind of declaration kind of focused on a technical investment and measures without necessarily defining kind of the social and environmental safeguards that would be attached to that. And then the next one was around kind of responsible mining and critical minerals, which was obviously a big G20 theme in terms of its kind of representation of the African continent. F20 really pushed for strict environmental standards, circularity, traceability, and kind of biodiversity safeguards. And then obviously, as I'm sure everyone saw in the final declaration and also in the kind of deliberations leading up to the Leaders Summit, the G20 really focused on kind of beneficiation and industrial development, but didn't really outline, the kind of environmental or social protection that would be attached to that, at least not in a kind of committal way. And then the last one was around kind of industrial decarbonization. F20 was really trying to kind of push for a harmonized emission standards. and kind of global verification systems. And this was a agenda that we have been pushing for the last couple of years and are really trying to kind of create kind of continuity around going into the US presidency, where we will probably not kind of be successful or push the needle any further, but are kind of focusing our efforts on a UK presidency and have started to kind of do some kind of a key advocacy activity around that. In this kind of industrial decarbonization space, the G20 obviously like avoids any mandatory standards, and instead promotes this technologically like neutral industrial pathways. And then we also looked a bit at kind of analyzing the convergence points between the G20 declaration and this BRICS energy cooperation roadmap. And there's some kind of interesting like convergence and divergence points. So in terms of like energy security and national sovereignty being kind of fundamental to an energy transition, which was a big kind of BRICS priority this year in Rio. The G20 kind of reaffirms this energy security remains fundamental to national sovereignty. And this is obviously kind of in response to the Russia-Ukraine crisis and what we've been seeing over the last couple of years. And like in the BRICS roadmap, it makes this kind of clear link between energy security and kind of energy diversification. And then the same kind of technological neutrality that we see in the G20 declaration is also kind of reflected in the BRICS roadmap, and that's obviously just because of the kind of members of that club. And then in terms of infrastructure grids and transmission expansion and modernization, which was a big kind of BRICS priority, the G20 also called for supply and demand side management, transmission expansion, modernization, infrastructure, resilience, and integrated planning. So a lot of kind of similarities in even the kind of messaging and languaging in those two documents. And then in terms of like the financing, but de-risking, blended finance, concessional funding for developing countries, a lot of that was also kind of translated into the G20 final text that talked about this kind of scaled up investment, especially in developing countries, with concessional finance, blended finance mechanisms, risk mitigation instruments, and enabling environments being prioritized in the kind of G20 declaration. Also, again, very similar kind of language to BRICS. And then BRICS also focused on domestic mineral value chains and kind of sustainable industrialization, and which we obviously then saw in the declaration as well. Just some kind of closing remarks on these different like agenda setting moments throughout 2025. I think the G20 kind of stops short of fully embracing BRICS fossil fuel heavy mix and institutional sovereignty kind of mode, which is obviously a win, but kind of we have to ask ourselves the question of what like next year looks like in terms of South Africa's kind of multilateralism, given its position in BRICS. I think there was kind of limited ambition on climate finance and de-risking, even though the declaration acknowledges finance gaps. It doesn't really introduce new quantified funding commitments and mechanisms for kind of fair burden sharing, etc. Um, and then it also kind of missed commitments on responsible mining and critical minerals, even though it kind of supported expansion of critical mineral supply chain. The G20 like failed to establish environmental safeguards, biodiversity protections, and kind of circularity requirements. And then obviously the last point is just that it kind of had this insufficient accountability mechanisms in place. So kind of keep commitments around finance, grid expansion or modernization, industry decarbonization were all obviously voluntary, with no clear kind of monitoring, reporting, or verification mechanisms in place or suggested for tracking those. Yeah, and then obviously it kind of avoids political commitments to workers and labor transitions. So while the G20 kind of recognizes the skills for the future wording, but does not establish transition support mechanisms in the way that we were hoping. Yeah, so a lot of work to do, and F20 obviously will be present in the USG20 processes next year, but at a much smaller scale, and it's very difficult to kind of understand what that landscape will look like. And so one of the key instruments that we are using to kind of push the recommendations that we published in February, tweaking them slightly to kind of adapt to our new reality, but working much closer with kind of subnational governments and trying to figure out how we can create this sort of parallel streams to the G20, and how philanthropy can kind of be used to target that space instead of necessarily like the formal G20 processes. Yeah, so an open invitation to anyone to kind of think through that with us. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Raisa. Thank you. And I do hope that that invitation is taken up in the question and answer session just now, because we do have to really strategize in this new reality we find ourselves in, quite jarringly after our very successful G20, which was very open and democratic. Without further ado, I will, for the sake of time, just quickly introduce Ellen, our next speaker. Ellen Lorimer is a climate policy consultant based in South Africa with 20 years of experience in climate diplomacy, capacity building, and project coordination. Ellen has coordinated various civil society climate networks and has worked closely with civil society organizations, development agencies, academic institutions, and government institutions with a focus on climate adaptation and finance. This year, she has coordinated the G20 working group of the International Climate Politics Hub and has supported the coordination of the Africa CSO G20 Climate, Energy and Sustainable Finance Group. And just before Ellen goes, I want to just say that Ellen was asked exclusively to speak on the G20, given her involvement there. So we have not asked her to speak at all on COP30.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the intro. Yes, it's been a whirlwind year of G20 for me, but I think it is important in these spaces to reflect on how these different multilateral processes influence each other, and I think it's a timely discussion to look forward as well as how forums like the G20 and COP have impacted and have the potential to impact our work going forward. So I am going to share some slides. I just wanted to note that as you all have seen, we have a lot of interlinkages between our networks and our work, and I'm really glad that Tanya in particular noted this, but I think all the speakers have. So there are overlaps in our work, which I think are really positive. So I'm here speaking as the G20 working group lead for the International Climate Politics Hub, which is a climate diplomacy network. But at the start of this year, we were part of forming the Africa CSO G20 network, and I'm glad Kunda is here to speak on that side of things. So our work had focused quite a lot on the behind-the-scenes diplomacy work. We write briefings and find what
Apologies. I think we might have lost Ellen quickly. I think I will just perhaps. I hate to interrupt her. She was just taking off, but perhaps for the sake of our sanity, maybe can I call on Kundai, our next speaker? Unless
Sorry
Ellen,
about that. I am back.
Wonderful. Okay, wonderful. Sorry about that.
Apologies,
Okay,
my network dropped off a cliff. So thanks very much, and sorry for the pause there. And great that Kundai is following me. So I was just talking about how the G20 does come with some structural challenges with its rotating presidency, lack of enforcement mechanisms, which we've heard other speakers talk about. It is very much based on consensus, which can be challenging with such diverse interests. At the same time, we did see South Africa put forward a very climate ambitious agenda this year, with climate across a number of their working group streams. They followed on from a series of developing country hosts, which is great in terms of putting forward agendas like the just transition. So there was lots of work that could be echoed in this year's G20. It was a year, though, where we saw significant pushback by the US against the climate agenda. But to be fair, it wasn't just the US. There are others who kind of hide in their shadows, like Argentina, like Saudi Arabia on the energy agenda. So where they were part of these discussions, things were blocked. Where they were absent, things could move forward. And that meant when we got to a leaders summit with a boycott essentially from the US, we were able to move ahead with a consensus declaration that had climate throughout. So as the ICPH, we have seen this as a climate win. Yes, all those limitations that previous speakers have spoken about are there. But at one stage, we didn't know if we would be able to get a consensus, and we didn't know if we'd be able to keep climate on the agenda, particularly since at ministerial level, we were landing up with chair summaries, very small declarations agreed by consensus. What this did allow is for some of the text, which was more ambitious, that was kept in the chair's summary, to make its way back into the leaders' declaration. So that was something that we specifically suggested, learning from the G7 experience, where they didn't even try to put climate on. And South Africa must be credited for working really hard to keep climate on the agenda, particularly our Department of Environment. At the same time, the Energy Transitions Working Group was led by our energy ministries, which actually took a very different approach. You know, they'd emphasize things like energy security, but we're pushing in their nuclear energy, LP gas. Kuda spoke quite passionately about the Clean Cooking Agreement, which was the only declaration that they agreed, and really heavily emphasized LP gas. It opens the way, if you're talking about all sources of energy, for options like fossil fuel to continue if you're focused purely on energy security. We've also had pushback on an international scale on funding. So even though funding energy transitions was one of the presidency's goals for the year, this is not, to be fair, a forum where you usually see financial commitments. It's usually on the sidelines. G20 is very much a signaling space. It's where you get high-level delegates, ministers, presidents together in a room to talk about key issues, but it's not great when it comes to implementation. So, yeah, what did we see? We did see an early consensus at the Leaders Summit, which caught me by surprise. I thought we'd have the weekend to wait. And there we had a consensus in the absence of the US, which I think was really important for the reinforcement of the importance of multilateralism. That these large economies could get together, could come to an agreement on all of those many pages of text and kept climate throughout, I think is really important. It does also frame climate as a systemic risk, that it drives inequality and slows development. It had language reaffirming a lot of the UN conventions. That is where implementation happens. Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree limit, and a goal of mid-century net zero pathways. And language that we're pleased to see on the scaling of climate finance from billions to trillions. This is much better in the Leaders' Declaration on identifying needs than suggesting solutions. As you can see here, there was support for language on tripling renewables, doubling energy efficiency. And again, identifying needs around adaptation, resilience, and nature. I thought it was really interesting that the statement in G20 around reversing deforestation by 2030 was much stronger than we saw coming out of COP itself, despite this being hosted in Brazil. Timing-wise, it was really interesting that the G20 came after the COP this year, so we had President Lula coming directly from the COP to the G20, and I think that might also have been one of the reasons that we saw things being added there. That wasn't something that I saw strongly in the negotiations this year. Although, as you've heard others say, in the negotiations, well, civil society doesn't get to be in the room. We got to be in a science policy dialogue, which was new and unusual in the environment and climate sustainability, but largely we're working on the outside. We're campaigning through the media, through briefings, through events. We don't get to be part of the G20 negotiations. And I think going forward into the US presidency, we're likely to see a lot of backwards movement on that and the small gains that have been made on participation. And lastly, to note on the positives, good to see African priorities elevated, like disaster risk reduction, debt sustainability, energy transitions, which we'll go into a little more, and could also touched on the critical minerals aspects. Having said that, there are a number of gaps. We talked about the limited support for action, delivery pathways, despite recognizing the risks. Climate finance in particular, it's a lot of emphasis on the private sector finance, voluntary initiatives around technology transfer, reliance on all sources of finance. So very little emphasis on what G20 members themselves need to do here, which is disappointing. And very disappointing, you've also heard other speakers mention on fossil fuel phase out. Not strong in G20. Previously, it had language on phasing out fossil fuel, well, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. We didn't even have that language, let alone talking about phasing out fossil fuels altogether. There is some mention of local inclusion, both around critical minerals and food systems, but we didn't feel that went far enough in terms of talking about roles in decision-making, access to finance. What does it really mean if you're talking about local? Do you mean local countries, or do you mean the actual communities that would be affected by mining, by climate impacts, and what role would that be? And I think Raisa talked a fair bit about participation as well. The debt climate links were noted, but again, there are no real solid tools put forward. Things are voluntary case by case. And then I think there are some useful outputs that give us those hooks, not just in the decision text, but also in some of the expert groups that met and produced reports this year, that we need to make sure that those recommendations do find homes, if not in the US G20, then in other forums. For example, in some of the African institutions, which a lot of this year's agenda spoke to. We
Oh, Ellen, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but we seem to have lost you again. If we can, yeah, video is off. I was going to say take video off. Maybe we give it a minute or 30 seconds.
that
There we go. Ellen, if you can hear me, you're cutting out again. Ellen?
asked for, this energy security framing looked positive potentially at the beginning for inclusion where there were blockers, but really it diverts focus from what we'd like to see around universal access, equity, sustainability, and addressing energy poverty. It was really disappointing to see that only ministerial outcome being focused on clean cooking being only one component of energy poverty and access to energy, and that failed to speak to renewables. And then the justice element that I think some of the previous speakers spoke to as well, that really could be in there much more strongly. And I think some of these energy outcomes were not just about the G20 group coming together, but also the leadership in that energy transitions working group. We don't currently have the same kind of climate forward leadership in our energy sector at the moment. In terms of scaling renewable energy and energy efficiency, we did get our tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency language in there by 2030. We had asked for a higher ambition for Africa to meet its needs, and for G20 countries to align their NDCs. Unfortunately, the NDCs were not as progressive as we were like. Many submitted very late in the process. So again, these processes, they don't necessarily fall under G20 itself, but implementation happens elsewhere through mechanisms like the UNFCCC. Unfortunately, this technology neutral approach really does leave the door open, though, for any technology. Phase out of fossil fuels, I'm not going to go into that much more. I really thought that was a disappointing outcome this year. And then financing, there really was very little that was tangible that came out despite this being a priority for the South African presidency. And I don't think this is G20 only. This is around the developed countries' approaches to climate finance very broadly at the moment, and really not being wanting to be tied down to additional commitments there. And that echoes through into this space. So a lot of emphasis on domestic and private finance, concessional and blended finance, and the voluntary nature of commitments. I was also quite disappointed to see a lot of emphasis on the need for developing countries to create enabling environments without talking about the support required to do that as well. Africa was quite central to the agenda this year. We'd hoped to see a reference to some initiatives like the Africa Continental Master Plan, Africa 50, alongside the emphasis on equity and social benefits. So there was reference to Africa in many different parts of the G20 outcomes. At the leader level, but we already discussed the lack of ministerial consensus. But unfortunately, while it talked about this Mission 300, which is a World Bank FDB initiative, it didn't really speak to some of those other ones that we were hoping would be mentioned there. So in terms of looking forward and where we're going to next, the US presidency, has already talked about scaling back. They don't want to be looking at climate. We know that they're pushing fossil fuels in their own space, so that's likely to be a challenging space to engage, challenging as civil society, and a lot of us are not feeling like it would be worth putting a lot of energy into that if it's not going to be progressive. And we also have the
Ellen, we've lost you again. Okay, I think Ellen was wrapping up. So I'm going to go to our next speaker, I think. No,
in
okay.
certain forums. Sorry, this is my
Ellen,
last slide,
sorry.
just clapping up.
Sorry, just to say, I don't know if you can move, or it just keeps cutting out every now and again. So we would love to hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sorry about
that. No problem.
So the air quality workshop planned by South Africa this coming year, which could be if there's a way for civil society to engage, to lobby as well. France's G7 is planning to invite some of the industrialized countries to participate, and then looking forward to future G20 initiatives. Those expert groups I mentioned, and then other multilateral spaces, including under the UN system. So we are looking to have the COP the year after next in Ethiopia, in Africa again. And I think it's these sorts of spaces that we can look to take this agenda forward, because it's very unlikely to have much anchorage in the 2026 G20 process. So it's been a whirlwind of a year for civil society, a lot of campaign issues happening, and I'm glad that Kundai is coming next to speak a little more about the African civil society perspective on climate campaigning. I'll leave it at that. Apologies for the poor connection there. I will share the slides as well in case that is helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. Wonderful. That's fantastic about the slides, and wonderful presentation. And no problem. These things happen to everybody. Thank you very much. And then I will introduce Kundai. Thank you. Kundai Ngwenya is a climate change advocate who focuses on women and gender, just energy transition, and climate diplomacy. Her advocacy involves working with children, youth, and women, and persons with disabilities. She has a diverse work and academic background, including being a qualified metallurgy technician, media and communications practitioner. So thank you, Kundai.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all the speakers, as we actually resonate in most of the issues they've raised. So just taking it up from where Ellen left, yes, I've been part and parcel of the Africa Civil Society Group, Group 20, where we've been focusing on sustainable finance, climate and energy network. So in this network, we started our engagements as much as I can remember, February, where we had several discussions around different areas to do with air quality, adaptation, just energy transition, and so on. These were some of the areas. And we, towards the G20, we then developed 3 key demands. And those 3 key demands, with the first one in no particular order, of course, there was the issue of phasing out of fossil fuels, but looking at it being time-bound, not just something that we can talk about or something that we can see on paper. We also had issues to do with adaptation finance and it was coming from a point to say the rate at which climate change is affecting the global south, in particular Africa, the rate must resonate with the existing of the finance. Hence, adaptation finance now was one of our demands. And then the other demand was centered on issues to do with the issues of debt cancellation around sustainable finance and so on. So going to the G20 process, that is the peak of the process, these were our demands. And I'm glad Ellen has highlighted how the surface was in terms of diplomacy, looking at how member states from G20 were the willingness to be able to quickly to adopt some of these issues, all that. So I'll not dwell much into that. So for the G20 processes, there were a lot of A to Z's, 20s. And for us, we managed to be part and parcel of the C20, that is the peak during the G Social 20. So from the G Social 20 declarations, coming back to our demands now, the issue of debt cancellation was very clear to then say debt cancellation and debt relief must be mechanisms that must be incorporated around climate finance. So that aspect, looking at the G Social 20 declaration, was put forward within that declaration. We also had issues to do with the easier access to finance for vulnerable groups, which was also highlighted. And it was coming to the basis that when we look at our demand on adaptation finance, most vulnerable groups are failing to be able to in terms of our context, we're failing to be able to acquire this kind of financing that do exist but so the core was to make it easier for them so that they are able to easily access this kind of finance and drive locally led adaptation solutions around climate change. So that was also that is something that came forward. And then moving on now, coming to the peak, that is the G20 South Africa Leaders Declaration. There were wins, yes, and like other colleagues have said, there are things that still needs to be done. One of the wins around the issues of energy indicate where the aspect of the tripling of the investments energy that is globally the energy capacity globally was the commitment for the tripling and the target put as 2030. But however, the issues now around the actual process of the transition, that is the phasing out of fossil fuels and the targeting was not so clear in that. So the issue is we are talking about financing, but the transitioning aspect of coming out of that fossil fuels was not clear in line with that. Then, just as Ellen has said, the issues of scaling up investments around different financial models, this was put from a national perspective, a member state's individual perspective. And then when we look at the African context, something that we've been battling with is the accreditation of financial institutions to be able to access different forms of climate finance. For example, the Green Environment Facility Fund, all those things that do exist. So as much as the declaration is brought it back to individual level for member states, but the question is, how far are we regarding our capacity to be able to access that? So there comes now the issues of inequality coming into play, but possibly hiding behind the finger. Then when it comes to critical minerals, I can remember that Kuda highlighted the G20 critical minerals framework. Some of the contents from the framework are based on the declaration. They look very good. Like, for example, the local community participation, which is what we've been pushing for. The promoting of local beneficiation at the point of source, which is what we've been pushing for, even for the AU and EU meetings. This is what have been pushed for. But then there's an aspect of it it's a non-binding blueprint. It's a voluntary basis blueprint. So it can still take us to a point of business as usual, though we have written this, put all these wording and frameworks down. So one of the things that we still need to advocate for is civil society in terms of going forward is to make sure that these aspects, they move from voluntary to something that can be legally binding, so that at least we know that we can then hold leaders accountable, because it's as it looks like now, you cannot really hold anyone accountable because they will tell you that it's voluntary. We choose to or we choose not to. So this has been the challenge. And if you look at some countries, most countries within the G20, some of them, they are actually investing, or for lack of better context, carrying out businesses in terms of the critical minerals value chain. That is the wording they've used. So, but in most of them, if they are carrying out business, like China is a good example, and they are then saying that this framework must be voluntary. The question that then remains is, do they really want to, number one, have local community participation, which is what is part and parcel of the framework? Number two, do they really want to promote local beneficiation at the point of source, which are some of the aspects? Because all this is voluntary. So we really need to push in terms of the aspect of issues being voluntary. And then the other part, what is the issue of the wording? We appreciate that the AU has come into, it was part of this G20 South Africa summit. But then again, when it comes to minerals in terms of this context, at the AU, they have the Africa Green Minerals Strategy. And the Africa Green Minerals Strategy is talking about green minerals. It's not talking about critical minerals. So the issue of harmonizing of wording becomes very critical to then say, if at continental level we are talking about green minerals, what then happened for us to be able to accept the wording critical minerals? So the wording can also tell you the atmosphere now, when coupled with issues to do with this framework being voluntary and also non-binding. But then again, just like what Kudai has already highlighted, that South Africa is now taking over the SADC chairmanship. Right now, currently within SADC, the mining protocol is under review. So we hope and pray that some of the issues that have come from the critical minerals framework would find their way into the protocol, and the protocol would then be ratified and signed and adopted in such a way that at least it can protect us from this voluntary and non-voluntary basis way of doing things. And then going forward, other issues that also have been a little bit of missing out have been the issues of clearly highlighting vulnerable groups such as the women, the youth, persons with disabilities, and the children. When you look at the declaration, that is the G20 South Africa Leaders Declaration, the aspects of children is around health. It's not really around issues to do with the just transition, the green skills and all that. Yet the children are people who are supposed to be thinking around what skills can I do that will be of essence in terms of at a certain timeline, let's say 2050, so that their mind and mindset is channeled towards skills of paramount importance. So these are some of the issues. When you look at persons with disabilities, they are just highlighted around the health component, not necessarily around other particular aspects of the declaration. So these are some of the areas that we can actually move forward in terms of advocacy and advocating. So an opportunity is there through the SADC channels, and also opportunities could be there as we move to the next G20 presidents. But those issues are issues then we need to take up. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Kundai. Thank you so much. That was excellent. And just for the sake of time, our meeting, we have half an hour left. I will not speak to each, I won't wrap up each of our excellent speakers, but just draw out common themes. It seems that obviously it's not all or nothing, and different speakers have highlighted different values in the different processes from COP and specifically most speakers spoke to G20. But while there have been some openings that speakers have highlighted, there are also serious gaps, and a common theme that most speakers raised is just the lack of the language that's there without anything binding, and the voluntary nature, and just the limited ambition falling far short of what we need as the region. That was a common theme that we do need to be aware of. But also, yeah, there is strong momentum in our region from in spite of this, from union, civil society, philanthropy, and local governments to push for accountable community-centered transitions. I hope that in our question and answer session we're about to have, that people do latch onto to the openings for discussions of ways forward. And I would like now to, I will hand over to my colleague Fozia Davids to co-host shortly, but I will take the first round of questions. If anyone has specific questions that they would like for specific speakers or just for all speakers, but questions from the floor, if you want to raise your hand or if you want to put your questions in the chat, we now have half an hour to engage. Apologies, I haven't been, I don't know, I want to be fair, but I don't know about orders. I think Soraya Bayat Khan, I think your hand was probably first. I'll just take 3 hands for now. So Soraya first. I'm looking in the chat, Tafadzwa Moropa. Colleagues, is there another hand? Should I go with those 2 first? Apologies, I'm not seeing another hand. Okay, Soraya, yes, Soraya. If you can also, so if you can just housekeeping, sorry. If everybody can please introduce themselves before they say their question, and if it's for a specific speaker, can you also please say that? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not very good at this, but yes, my name is Suraya. I'm with Iwadi and I'm with Sawid, and I'm interested in getting a response from Kundai, who's the last speaker, because from her input, I think it would be good if we could find a way to connect with one another. And if it is possible to draft, I put all the things in the chat for a presentation and for a submission that we want to start as a grassroots group. So the message is all that I sent would apply to Kundai for assistance and what can be done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Soraya. Thank you very much. And Kundai, if you can, then I will also send to you if you can't see it in the chat. But if you can then see Soraya's message sent at 11, I see. Well, several messages. That is to yourself then. Secondly, great, thumbs up. Okay, then Tafadzwa, and after Tafadzwa, Richard Worthington after Tafadzwa. So Tafadzwa, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Please confirm if you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Hello?
Loud and clear. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much. My name is Tafadzwa Mropa. I'm the Nexus and Climate Justice Advisor at Action Aid for Zimbabwe and Zambia. My contribution is mainly looking at forward-looking as we go into 2026, and also acknowledging the fact that within Southern Africa, we acknowledge that there isn't any cohesion or coordination within the climate change discourse. So it is fragmented, and that makes it difficult to speak with one voice. It would have been good also to hear perspectives from the farmers' unions around how they participated in the COP30 space as well, especially for smallholder farmers. So my proposal is that as we go into 2026, and the good thing that South Africa is going to be the incoming chair for SADC Summit, is there a way in which through SALO, there could be more of like enhanced engagement and coordination of other key actors who might not have been part of this meeting, so that we are able to come up with concrete action plans, not only for SADC, but also as we go towards COP31. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Tafadzwa. Thank you very much. And then Richard Worthington.
Thanks. My question's actually in the chat, but yeah, I'm volunteer with Project 90 by 30 and friend of the Climate Justice Coalition, and I was participating with the ACG20 network. So thanks for all the great inputs. If Tanya's still on, I'd love to hear a little bit more on, I think this year did provide opportunities for greater interaction among civil society and more broadly with organized labor and others. And it's really interesting to hear from the different F20, etc. Be good to hear follow-up from Raisa about how one may engage with F20 on that reflection she was talking about. But yeah, my particular interest is going into, largely covered by Tafadzwa, actually, but also maybe just to bring in the African Union a bit there about whether what, the engagement of African Union with G20, whether this is something we think provides renewed opportunity. I mean, ECOSOC, the AU institution for, I forget exactly the acronym, but civil society engagement, has been around for ages, but has not been particularly accessible. Might this signal a bit of a change? So, yeah, any other reflections on how we can build on the increased comradely interactions that have happened during this year? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Okay, before I take more hands in another round, can I hand over then to our speakers to engage with the questions addressed to them?
Boris, I can answer the last one from Richard there around the African Union. I think that's the most poignant one.
Great.
At least on my end. Yeah, thanks for the questions. I think, yeah, and then I'll speak a bit to the SADC plans. Around African Union, Richard, I think it's also important, and I was thinking about this after I spoke, that the African Union does actually not understand how important their G20 seat is. It's like they were hesitant to actually do the work this year when South Africa was hosting it, seemingly willing for South Africa to take the lead and African Union actually not having a voice. That's the nice translation of them not participating as much as I think they should have. So I think this is a strong problem that we have with any African institution, right? But I would like to give examples of COP process. The Africa Group of Negotiators have been very, very good in terms of bringing together the ideas from the African continent that are then shaping COP conversations. We need to set up a similar system for the G20 process that can be under the African Union or set up as a separate branch of some sort. Effectively, we need an institution of some sort that is under the African Union that takes care of G20 processes, and that's not currently there. So even the civil society ECOSOC process that you mentioned, there were ramblings about trying to organize conversations with civil society for the G20, but it was just highly ineffective. So that's definitely something we can work on a bit more as we go ahead. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Tanya, do you want to come in?
Please, yes, thanks. Thanks very much. And thanks, Richard, for your comments. I agree with you in terms of your comments that you wrote in terms of advancing regional cooperation. We keep saying we need a regional industrial strategy. We need a regional strategy around how we're going to handle a just transition, and we're not seeing us actively involved in it or anything being implemented in a way that reflects all of our demands. So that is an area that we need to take forward. On working together, the various civil society formations going forward, I think it's absolutely essential. The one good thing about this engagement is that I've met a whole range of comrades who I hadn't met before. And I now know what you're doing. And so when COSATU organizes events and we invite civil society, it becomes significantly easier for us to make sure that we're inviting a wider range of people now that we know who you all are as well. The challenge, as always going forward, is to see how we make sure that when we're engaging in a way that is accessible and leads to action. For Labour, one of the challenges still then is that all the Labour federations continue to work together, so that as federations we're mobilizing, and then how we extend that into civil society as well, and that we include you more. Where comrades have activities and want Labour to be involved, please know we want to be involved with progressive formations. We're happy to contribute, and if you invite us to stuff, we'll also try and make sure that we can. But I think the key thing is that there's some key events coming up where we could well find ways to start taking action already. So the one big thing that's easy, where we have high levels of agreement, for example, is around anti-austerity and the budget. I think a common demand from Labour is that we don't want a neoliberal agenda dictating our paths and looking at to meet the needs of capital, not people. So perhaps in run-ups to the budget, there's space for us to engage and start pulling demands on that. But there are also very concrete demands that Labour is very keen to fight that affect communities on a day-to-day basis. So issues around, for example, high food prices and increasing food prices. There are some groupings working on those areas. Mention had been made about, for example, what farmer unions are doing. Those are concrete areas that we can find each other on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think you've raised a lot of really good points, especially in the lead up to the budget setting next year, and how civil society can mobilize to just adequately organize to ensure that those sort of demands and proactive plans are put together. So thank you for those contributions. Ati, can I call on you and then Shepherd to come in after as well? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think one aspect. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, you good?
Yeah, I think one aspect is I think it's a point of a comment in a way that it was also indicated by the panelists in terms of how the AU actually did not utilize its seat as a G20 kind of a member to push for all these reforms that were sought in terms of climate, but also in relation to the funding. You see, the problem with the funding aspect of just transition is it's a fact that it has to be collaborated broadly. So what kind of key elements that can be elevated in terms or in relation to the key aspects of funding from the agreements that have been established through the G20 in South Africa, and will that be possible in relation to the AU's vision when it comes to issues of climate change? That's the question that I'm posing to all the panelists, if they can reflect on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ati, for that contribution. Shepherd, can I call on you, please?
Hi. Sure. Thank you. So much for the list for the brilliant submissions. I just want to highlight something. I think we know the impasse that is between South Africa and the US administration at the moment. We know very well that from the beginning, for reasons unknown and probably known, but we may not want to deal with that. That from the onset, that the US administration dismissed, the some things that South Africa had set in place and other countries, that it was anti-Americanism, and we know that there was even a plan, not conclusively, that maybe Trump may not invite South Africa to the G20 meeting in 2026. I'm wondering, in addition to that, especially just talking about, renewable energy, Trump has already started stripping off the words renewable energy, from the, from their work, especially the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. This is recent news. And I'm wondering how that work can be carried forward, but taking in cognizant that, US doesn't like this, climate work or climate related work and renewable energy jargon in their work. How can they work with the next presidency, which is UK in 2027, and of course South Korea in 2028? So I'm just wondering, what's the best for us now to take on the good work and the brilliant work that is highlighted in the declaration, so that it's not like disturbed in the coming years. So that's basically my question for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shepard. I think really vital questions that you're asking, especially based on the gains South Africa's made at both COP30 and at G20, especially around that commitment to mobilizing finance for renewable energy and the energy transition, and to say that commitments can't be linked without finance because it becomes unimplementable, especially for African countries. So I'd really be interested to hear the panelists' contributions on that one. Ellen, can I call on you, please?
Thanks very much. I'm just responding on a mix of these issues. I fully agree with what the previous speakers said about the lack of AU engagement, and I would extend that to say the African observer states who were also invited. You see other European observer states who are invited every year, who speak up almost as equals to the G20 members, and we didn't see the African states doing that. There was an Ouder NEPAD hosted preparatory meeting in October, which also included civil society think tanks. But I just note that that came just before the Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group meeting. It didn't get to the level of negotiating text, and the AU needs to be putting forward suggestions on text and to be looking out for what needs to be, where they need to hold the ground. There was a very dominant role by Kenya there, and just very few other African countries even in participation there. So I think that's a big one. The AU has this platform. They should also be the ones speaking up now about South Africa's exclusion. Well, all G20 members should, but they do have a role to play there. In terms of the US G20, I think that it will be important to hold the ground on certain issues. We want to make sure that there isn't backsliding. That requires that one's in the room or that there's a broader boycott, but participation remains important from state actors, at least, even if civil society is excluded. So I think that work with the AU is important. The other opportunity is to try and progress issues that don't say the word climate, but in different ways, different framing. We thought energy security could do that, but just warning that that links us to conflict and other issues, that it's not a great one for progress. And then looking for other spaces to move forward. The subnational action that Foundations 20 was looking at, that's really important to show that countries like the US, there is still action happening, even if it isn't at the state, the federal level. So yeah, I don't know what the role is for us in G20, but on the sidelines and working and engaging more strongly with some of these bodies like the AU, I think remains important. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for those contributions and really highlighting the sort of critical role the AU can play, especially around rallying support for South Africa's exclusion. Thank you so much. So Soraya and then Kundai.
Oh, good. Thank you. Is my audio on? Yes, I just needed to find out if anyone on the group or if SALO has been participating in the national dialogue program that's going on for civil society. There's a civil society national dialogue caucus that takes place, and all this information should be there for the civil society to engage with, to understand wholly what is going on and what transpired at the G20. So I'm not sure if anyone is involved in the national dialogue, or we're still waiting for the confirmation of who the steering committee members are for the national dialogue. And of course, there's all the other dramas that takes place, but I just thought I'll ask if anyone here knows about the National Dialogue Caucus for Civil Society. Thank you.
Thanks, Soraya. Thank you. Perhaps I can just call on my colleagues to come in and just raise their hand if there are any responses to that. In the interim, and then I can just ask Kundai to make a contribution.
Okay, thank you so much. Firstly, to Soraya, I've shared with you my email address so we can take up the conversations. Then on the issue of the US and South Africa also having issues in terms of their diplomatic ties, one suggestion I would start to propose is the issue of continuous bilaterals amongst the member states, so that we are able to then break through the ground, not only wait for 2026 December, but to start the engagements now. Continuous bilaterals can yield that which we are looking for. And then the other issue is also the issue of wording. Now that they are taking over presidents, just like Eileen has said, we also need to align our wording in terms of what we are trying to advance based on what they are looking for. Like I'll look at this very recent submission. It's under the heading United States assumes presidents of the Group of 20. So one of the things that has been highlighted is that as we usher in these much demanded reforms, we will prioritize 3 core things. So already their priorities are out. So for us to be able to, in terms of the engagement through bilaterals, we then have to align ourselves with their 3 core themes. And then one of them is unlocking affordable and secure energy supply chains. So this then speaks to the energy, the just energy transition. So continuous bilaterals, aligning ourselves with their core themes, I'm sure can play a certain part, a certain role. We have seen these continuous bilaterals making impact, but over a long period. And also, it's the AU headquarters. There's also this the EU, the UK Aid Africa office, the EU, and so on. So these are all some of the areas that we can look at. Yes, Richard, I saw your comment, but like I said, aligning ourselves to that based on our demands could be a starting point.
Thank you so much. Can I now call on some of the speakers to make some of those contributions and responses to what the respondents have raised? Thank you so much.
If I may speak, thanks. So thanks very much for comrades who have just raised really interesting and useful points. For me, what is highlighted is that the AU is a space we must contest. So our experience of the AU, certainly in the L20 engagements, was that the AU was quite silent. But let's give them some space. It was their first year. We can and must contest them, and we must strengthen their hands so that they can play a more active role as well. And also remind them that they reflect our demands as well. So we need to look towards the AU. The second thing is in terms of the US, I take the points about engaging bilaterals, and I agree with all of that. The challenge for us is how are we going to strengthen the voice of civil society, whether it's heard or not heard in the formal engagements. That's another thing. That's not for us now. But unless we are strong, unless we have a voice, unless that voice is heard, we're going to be out of the game altogether. So how are we reaching out? I mean, we work with our sister unions in the US. I don't know which civil society formations they're working with there. I'm certainly happy in our engagements with them to stress the need that we want to engage broadly. Certainly, COSATU's focus is progressive organizations. We wouldn't want the mega crowd coming in claiming they're civil society and wanting to contest. Well, they can contest the space. We don't want them to claim the space. We want progressive formations to claim the space. So those 2 things. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ellen, I see that you have a response as well. Maybe if you'd also like to come in, and I think you are touching on the point that Tanya has raised, is that, it may open up that space to actors that have different intentions to do so, to activists trying to attain energy justice and climate justice. So Ellen, maybe I can call on you to come in as well.
Thanks very much. I think this speaks to the broader point of civil society cohesion and what happens when we leave the door open. So the civil society C20 space was very contested this year. It was very difficult. And I think part of that is because we didn't convene in advance and decide who we wanted to put forward and openly back them. Which meant that there was contestation and parties brought in to try and mediate who weren't appropriate. Civil society should be in a place to mediate and put forward its own leadership. And my worry is if we tried to boycott, it would leave space open for those that are happy to work with the Trump administration to step forward and claim that space. So I think it's very challenging in the formal engagement groups to do that. But it speaks to me about the importance of maintaining the linkages again that we've built this year across civil society and some of these different groupings. So that means both across some of the issue groupings, but also across some of our sectors in terms of labor, the think tanks, the typical NGOs, community-based organizations. How can we better build that cohesion so that there isn't that doesn't come up again, and make sure that we are ready to speak and say who we're speaking on behalf of and in what manner and what are the rules for that engagement. Who is able to speak on our behalf is very important. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's a very important question, Lwazi, and contribution as well, because who gets to speak on behalf, who, you know, and raising some of the points that you've raised is who represents the climate justice space and who actually carries through those actions. So Lwazi, I don't know if you also want to come in. But I think for me, I also have a question I wanted to ask the panelists as well. Based on the commitments made, especially at COP20 as well by South Africa, or the efforts undertaken as well at the G20, how can countries like South Africa and more broadly Africa position themselves to channel that climate finance in a way that centers equity, labor protections, and local development? And how can they actually make that climate finance land? And so moving out of the space of COP20 and G20 commitments into tangible climate financing for climate resilience. Thanks so much. Lwazi, do you want to come in?
Thank you so much, Fawzia. Thank you to SALO and the team. So this conversation reminds me of Antonio Gramsci's saying that the old is dying and the new is yet to be born, but in the interim, monsters emerge. And what we're currently facing is exactly what Antonio Gramsci was saying, that the old way of looking at multilateralism itself via a unipolar lens is dying, and the new is emerging. And in the interim, we have to deal with monsters. And and I suspect that for a lot of the climate activists, it is the Trump administration. What the South African government has done, and well, from the articulations of the South African government, is that there's a realization that there will be a lot of headways in the Donald Trump administration, especially concerning issues around climate change, and climate resilience, and building infrastructure concerning mitigation of climate-related disasters. But what is very important is that South Africa has now created engagements with the G7 member countries, in which some of the aspects concerning South Africa's G20 presidency, especially related to climate, will be transferred towards that. The second aspect is that South Africa is now part of the troika of the G20, in which some of the reporting concerning the initiatives South Africa is undertaking concerning the climate aspect, and especially other aspects that are progressive, the USA might exclude, are now related to the G20 in the UK. However, when you look at the BRICS declaration itself, what the BRICS declaration itself says that the BRICS member states will work together on climate issues, both at the G20 level, along with COP level, and other multilateral forums. So what is the key issue for South Africa this year? It's not necessarily whether or not it will participate in the US G20. It is whether or not South Africa is able to translate the outcomes of its G20 to other multilateral fora, proceed after the G20 in South Africa. Because there's a realization by multilateral actors that we are no longer in a unipolar world, where the unipolar world itself was fundamental to US shaping and US soft power in the current global dispensation. However, whether it's fortunate or not, the Trump administration has created a situation where the international community now has to seek other areas of solidarity in terms of its international partners. So for South Africa, and post G20 and post COP, what is fundamental from both civil society and from government lens is for us to ensure that these matters are translated into other multilateral fora. And should we as civil society not assist government in this matter, what will most likely happen is that we will allow the Trump administration to make some headways in their highly carbon and fossil fuels intensive industries, even though some of those industries now are not jobs related. And what will most likely be the outcome is that we will be having a situation where the environment itself is at detriment. However, but what we see from our European partners and along with our global South partners, that there is momentum towards issues around global financing for mitigation efforts. There is global financing for issues around building infrastructure for climate resilience. So on those two levels, we need to analyze South Africa's G20 from on its successes in terms of how did it address the matters at hand, but also how do we now charter a way and a methodology that is not only conducive for the environment and also the climate, but also how do we now charter a way that builds consensus amongst the global South, along with our global North peers, fully realizing the USA is withdrawing from the international system and fully realizing that new entities and powers are emerging from the international system. So getting that buy-in from the emerging powers, along with the historic allies of the USA that are currently in disagreement, will be very critical in how we frame and monitor the international system going forward. So I'd like to thank SALO for this dialogue. So going forward, and thank you so much, Fawzia, for steering the ship.
Thank you so much. So I'm not sure who is left because I see that some Kundai had to leave as well, but perhaps Ellen, Tanya, and if any of the other speakers as well would like to come in and just provide some contributions to some of those questions.
Thanks. I know we're short on time now. For me, it's been useful to have a reflection on this year's work, but I also feel like we do need to be shifting our focus towards going forward and which of these forums are worth our effort as civil society to engage with and our best engagement mechanisms. So if it's media outreach, how do we strengthen the types of engagements that go out there? Is our messaging clear that's going across different platforms? So thanks very much to SALO for convening us today. I know the ACG20 Kundai has left, but we'll be convening a meeting with its partners in early February to start some of that forward looking of which multilateral spaces and how we engage. And I hope that can overlap with a number of these that we've heard about today, of where we put our limited time and financial resources going forward to get the best bang for our buck. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Kurakwasha, I see that you are your camera is off, so maybe you'd like to come in, and then following all the responses, perhaps we can then move to closing remarks by the panelists, and then I'll call on my colleague Tiboho to close us off. Thank you so much.
Kanya. I think I'd rather do a closing remark, if that's okay with you, Fuzia. Because I think it speaks to what Ellen was speaking about in terms of forward-looking. I'm not excited for the Trump G20 leadership. I think it's going to be a terrible show, to say the very least. However, that does not mean that there's no continuous work we can do. I really think BRICS is going beyond the 5 countries that we know of being in BRICS. Egypt is now part of it. Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia. We really have to start thinking about all these other avenues, especially in the name of South-South cooperation, as well as SADC. And I'll keep emphasizing why I really think we underestimate the potential power of some of the institutions that are already existent. A lot of the work that we do, for obvious reasons, usually have a global, but they also have a north-looking, what I mean by north-looking, a global north-facing idea about solving things. We really need to start doing a lot more work with the African Union and with SADC. So I really hope we do a lot more work with SADC, with South Africa being the chair for this year. I think it's rare to have South Africa as the chair. Usually what happens, we have other countries that are a bit more authoritarian, to say the least, like my home country, like Zimbabwe, where the civil society will not have the opportunity to share and push certain agendas. So we should not underestimate the opportunity that we have over the next 9 months with South Africa. So I think that'll be my closing remark. And to say that let's keep the work going. I do see us making changes in the small ways that we are, but it's always going to be impactful at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kudakoshe. Can I call on the other speakers as well? Tanya, do you want to come in? And then we can also hand to Ellen and as well. Thank you. As well as Raisa, if Raisa is still with us.
I think Tanya had to step out.
Okay, Raisa, Ellen?
Thanks very much. And Raisa also had to leave earlier. Yeah, I'm going to close with saying that that I've really enjoyed engaging with this group this year. Some of you I've interacted with in different ways as we all get to grips with what the G20 can do and what it can't do. I think we got some good results in the context, in a challenging context, but we have gone through in some detail what the limitations of those are. When it comes to implementation, that's where we need our regional bodies, South Africa as the G20 presidency for this year has put a whole lot of things on the table that they have championed. It's in their interest to see that those do get followed through on and implemented, and that gives us one of those many hooks that we were talking about. They have an interest in seeing their language going somewhere and not just stopping dead. We need to still understand better how we use that as a hook for the AU better, to have a stronger relationships built there. What it means for Southern Africa, I think there was a lot said in the discussion. What is our broad positioning that goes beyond South Africa and looks at from a regional perspective as civil society as well? I think it becomes challenging to look beyond our everyday issues at the local level or at the national policy level to look bigger to regional and then international and these multilateral policy spaces. But that's a challenge for us to see how we can grow our messaging to fill all of these spaces so that it's truly Southern-led. And I think we've done a good job on that this year, and let's keep going. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and I really like how you've highlighted regional bodies and the role that I think especially through Southern Africa, and so just also pinpointing what Loazi has mentioned in the chat, South Africa is the chair of SADC over the next 2 years, and so we really need to use that influence the chairship has to have a more climate conscious chair agenda. So definitely in alignment with that. I'd like to hand over to my colleague Thibault, who is going to close the session for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fawzia, and my apologies to everyone for not having my camera on. I'm dealing with a bit of an unsightly eye infection. But nevertheless, I would like to a big thank you to all of the speakers for their thoughtful and considered reflections, as well as every participant who contributed to today's discussion. Each of these engagements highlights how important it is for Southern Africa to approach the just transition with clarity, cooperation, and a strong sense of regional responsibility. Today's conversation is a reminder that the outcomes of the recent G20 and COP30 gatherings carry real implications for Southern Africa's development pathways. These global processes shape the pace and direction of climate ambition, climate finance, and energy transitions. And it is essential that our region continues to position itself in ways that advance community needs, support workers, and safeguard vulnerable sectors. Today's insights also reinforce the necessity of ensuring that regional approaches remain people-centered and grounded in the lived realities of those most affected by environmental and economic change. And it's also clear that building a coherent regional response will require sustained dialogue, stronger coordination across sectors, and a commitment to ensuring that benefits and protections are fairly distributed. The contributions today also help deepen our collective understanding of the opportunities and risks ahead, and they offer, practical perspectives that can inform future planning and cooperation. Just to note that today's dialogue forms part of a wider set of initiatives that SALO is advancing to facilitate inclusive, constructive engagement on climate governance and regional development. And we remain committed, as always, to creating platforms such as these where civil society, governments, labor, business, and community representatives can think together about long-term solutions. Lastly, I think we would also like to express our sincere appreciation to the Norwegian People's Aid for supporting this work. Their partnership strengthens our ability to convene diverse voices and encourage meaningful regional conversations at a moment when they are particularly needed. Without much ado, I'd also want to thank you everybody for joining today's dialogue, especially considering that we're at the end of the year. So I know many people have many commitments and are quite busy coming to the end of the year. So thank you all for joining. We look forward to you continuing these discussions and continuing these discussions with you. And we hope you will join us in our future dialogues. If you've received an email for us, please be on the lookout for any upcoming dialogues. And remember to subscribe to our mailing list to stay updated. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.